The History of Everything You Use. Episode 1. Salt, the mineral that built empires. Opening. Welcome. Tonight we begin a new journey together. A journey not through the lives of kings or the fates of great battles, but through the quiet histories of the objects that surround us every single day. The things we hold, wear, eat, and use without a second thought. Because every ordinary thing, if you follow its story back far enough, becomes extraordinary. And there is no better place to begin than with the most ordinary substance of all. It sits on your table right now, in a small shaker, worth almost nothing. You could buy a kilogram of it for less than the price of a cup of coffee. And yet, for most of human history, this substance was so precious that wars were fought over it. Cities were founded because of it. Empires taxed it. Revolutions began over it. And in some places, it was quite literally used as money. Tonight, we are going to talk about salt. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift back, thousands of years back, to a time when a handful of white crystals could determine the rise and fall of civilizations. Part 1. Why we need salt at all. Before we can understand salt's place in history, we must understand its place in the body. Because the story of salt is, at its root, a story of biology. Sodium chloride, the chemical name for common salt, is not a luxury for the human body. It is a requirement. Sodium ions regulate the balance of fluids in our cells. They allow our nerves to fire, carrying electrical signals from the brain to the muscles. They allow the heart to beat. Without sodium, the muscles cramp, the mind grows confused, and eventually, the body simply stops. A human being deprived of salt entirely will die, just as surely as one deprived of water, only more slowly. Now, here is the crucial point, the point on which all of salt's history turns. For most of our existence as a species, humans were hunters. And meat, fresh meat, and especially blood, contains all the sodium a body needs. A hunter never has to think about salt. The animal has already gathered it. But around 10 to 12,000 years ago, in the period historians call the Neolithic Revolution, human beings began to farm. They settled down. They grew wheat, barley, lentils, rice. Their diets shifted from meat toward grain and vegetables. And grain contains almost no sodium at all. Suddenly, for the first time in the history of our species, salt became something humans had to find, to dig, to boil, to trade, to carry. The moment we became farmers, we became salt seekers, and we have never stopped. There is a lovely piece of evidence for how deep this craving runs, and it comes not from humans, but from animals. Wild deer, elephants and cattle will travel enormous distances to reach natural salt deposits, places known as salt licks. And archaeologists have long suspected that many of the earliest human trails, the paths that later became roads and later still became highways, began as animal tracks leading to salt. In a very real sense, some of the oldest roads on Earth were mapped out not by engineers, but by thirsty animals searching for sodium. Humanity simply followed. Part 2. The first salt towns. Where does salt come from? Broadly speaking, from two places. From the sea, where salt water can be trapped in shallow pools and left to evaporate under the sun, and from the earth, where the dried beds of ancient oceans, buried millions of years ago, survive as vast underground layers of rock salt. The earliest evidence of organized salt production takes us to a place that may surprise you, the town of Provadia in modern-day Bulgaria. Around 5,500 BC, that is 7,500 years ago, long before the pyramids, long before writing, the people of Pravadia were boiling brine from a salt spring in ceramic pots, evaporating the water and producing hard cakes of salt. And here is what makes Pravadia so remarkable. Archaeologists found that this small settlement of perhaps 350 people was surrounded by massive stone walls, fortifications of a scale wildly out of proportion to its size. And nearby, they found graves containing gold ornaments, some of the oldest processed gold in the world. A tiny town, enormously wealthy, and heavily defended. Why? The answer, almost certainly, is salt. Pravadia was producing something everyone needed and few could make. Its salt cakes travelled hundreds of kilometres along trade routes. Its people grew rich. And its walls tell us something else, that from the very beginning, salt wealth attracted envy, and envy attracted violence. Some scholars have gone so far as to call Pravadia one of the first true towns in Europe, a settlement that existed not because of farmland, but because of industry. Before there were cities of grain, there were cities of salt. A similar story unfolded across the ancient world. In the Austrian Alps, at a place called Hallstatt, Bronze Age and Iron Age miners tunneled deep into the mountain to carve out rock salt. The mining there was so extensive and the culture it supported so wealthy that historians name an entire era of European prehistory after it, the Hallstatt culture. The salt of those mines preserved everything it touched. The miners' leather shoes, their wooden tools, their ropes, even, on occasion, the miners themselves. The mountain that gave them wealth also gave them a strange immortality. And notice the names that salt left scattered across the map of Europe, like fingerprints. Hallstatt, Hallein, Halle, Salzburg, literally Salt Castle. In England, any town whose name ends in wich, Norwich, Sandwich, Nantwich, Droitwich, was once, in many cases, a place of salt production, from an old word for brine springs. The map of Europe is, in part, a map of salt. Part 3. Salt and the Dead. Egypt. Let us travel south now, to the valley of the Nile. The ancient Egyptians understood something profound about salt, that it does not merely flavour life, it defeats decay. Salt draws moisture out of organic material, and without moisture, the bacteria that cause rot cannot survive. Salt, in other words, stops time. The Egyptians used a naturally occurring salt mixture called natron, a blend of sodium carbonate and sodium chloride harvested from dry lake beds, as the central ingredient of mummification. The body of the deceased was packed in natron for roughly 40 days, until every trace of moisture had been drawn out. What remained could last not for years, but for millennia. When archaeologists opened tombs 3,000 years later, they found faces still recognizable, hair still in place. The Egyptian dream of eternal life was built, in a very literal chemical sense, on salt. But salt served the living as well. Salted fish from the Nile became one of Egypt's great export goods, traded across the eastern Mediterranean to the Phoenicians and the Greeks. And this points to salt's second great historical role, one that would shape the world for thousands of years: preservation as power. Think about what food preservation actually means for a civilization. Without it, food must be eaten where and when it is produced. A fisherman's catch rots in a day. A slaughtered pig must be consumed within the week. But with salt, fish becomes stockfish. Pork becomes bacon and ham. Cabbage becomes sauerkraut. Vegetables become pickles. Food can now travel. Food can be stored against winter, against famine, against siege. And most importantly, armies and navies can march and sail far beyond their fields. Salted provisions were the fuel of every ancient army and every sailing fleet. No salt meant no supply lines. No supply lines meant no empire. Remember that phrase. We will see it proven again and again tonight. Part 4. China, the first salt monopoly. Now we turn east to China, where salt's relationship with the state reached a level of sophistication the rest of the world would not match for centuries. Chinese salt production is astonishingly old. On the shores of Lake Yuncheng in northern China, communities were harvesting salt perhaps as early as 6000 BC. By the first millennium BC, the Chinese were drilling into the earth for brine using bamboo derricks, and in the province of Sichuan, they eventually drilled wells hundreds of meters deep, an engineering feat without parallel in the ancient world. In some of these wells, they struck not only brine, but natural gas, which they piped through bamboo tubes and burned to boil the very brine they had extracted. Fire from the earth, boiling salt from the earth, an integrated industrial process more than 2,000 years ago. But China's true innovation was not technical, it was political. In 654 BC, in the state of Qi, a minister named Guanzhong is credited with a fateful proposal, that the state should take control of the production and sale of salt. His reasoning was elegant and slightly sinister. A ruler who raises taxes directly makes his people angry, he observed, but everyone must buy salt. If the state controls salt and quietly raises its price, the people pay a heavy tax without ever quite seeing it. The tax hides inside the salt. This idea, the state salt monopoly, became one of the great pillars of Chinese government finance for the next 2,500 years. Under the Han Dynasty, around 119 BC, the imperial court nationalized both salt and iron, and this decision provoked one of the most fascinating documents of the ancient world, the Discourses on Salt and Iron, the record of a great debate held at the imperial court in 81 BC, in which Confucian scholars argued against government ministers over whether the state had any business running industries at all. The scholars argued that the monopoly enriched the state while impoverishing the people, and that government should be built on virtue, not profit. The ministers replied that the monopoly funded the army, defended the frontiers, and taxed the rich merchant more than the poor farmer. It is, in essence, a debate about state intervention in the economy, held more than 2,000 years before modern economics existed. Students of political theory still read it today, and the stakes were real. At various points in Chinese history, revenue from salt made up as much as half of the imperial government's income. Salt paid for the armies of the Tang. Salt, in a very real sense, helped fund the construction of the Great Wall and the Grand Canals. When the salt administration was strong, the empire was strong, and when smugglers undermined it, and salt smuggling was a perpetual, massive underground economy, dynasties trembled. More than one Chinese rebellion was led by men who began their careers as salt smugglers. Part 5. Rome, the Salt Road. Those of you who have followed our companion series on Roman history will find this next chapter especially familiar. Because Rome, the city itself, owes its existence in part to salt. Consider the geography. Rome was founded on hills beside the river Tiber, some 25 kilometers from the sea. At the river's mouth, near the town of Ostia, lay natural salt pans, shallow coastal flats where seawater evaporated and salt could be gathered. And Rome sat precisely at the point where the river could first be easily crossed. Whoever held that crossing controlled the movement of salt from the coast into the hungry interior of Italy, toward the Sabine Hills and the Apennine tribes beyond. One of the oldest roads in all of Roman history is the Via Salaria, literally the Salt Road, running from the salt pans near the sea, through Rome and deep into the mountains. It predates the empire. It may predate the city itself, as one of those ancient trails along which salt had moved for centuries before Romulus was ever imagined. Rome did not simply build a salt road. In a sense, the salt road built Rome. Roman writers understood salt's importance perfectly well. Pliny the Elder remarked that civilized life was impossible without salt. And Cassiodorus, centuries later, would observe that while men could live without gold, no one could live without salt. The Roman state kept a careful hand on the salt supply. During the wars against Carthage, officials fixed the price of salt in the city to keep it affordable for ordinary citizens, treating it as a strategic good, the way modern states treat oil or grain. Salted pork, salted fish, and the famous fermented fish sauce called garum, itself made with enormous quantities of salt, fed the legions on campaign from Britain to Mesopotamia. And then there is the most famous salt story of all, the word salary. The Latin salarium, the payment made to Roman soldiers, almost certainly derives from sal, salt. Now, historians debate exactly what the connection was. The popular claim that legionaries were literally paid in salt is probably a simplification. More likely, the salarium was originally money given to soldiers to purchase salt, or a payment associated with salt provisions. But the linguistic fossil remains embedded in our speech. Every time you speak of a salary, or say that someone is worth their salt, you are echoing the economy of ancient Rome. When we call a soldier who fights for money a soldier, and a professional worth their pay worth their salt, we are speaking, without knowing it, the language of the salt trade. Salt even entered Roman ritual and religion. Sacred meals began with salted grain. Newborn infants in many Mediterranean cultures were rubbed with salt, a practice mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as well. To share salt with a guest was to form a bond of trust. To spill it was an omen of broken friendship. Some of these superstitions survive to this day, every time someone throws a pinch of spilled salt over their left shoulder. Part 6. The Middle Ages. Cities built on white gold. When the Western Roman Empire faded, salt did not. If anything, its importance grew, because medieval Europe ran on preserved food to a degree we can barely imagine. Picture the European diet in the year 1200. For the vast majority of people, fresh meat was a rarity, available mainly in the autumn when animals were slaughtered before winter, because there was not enough fodder to feed them through the cold months. Everything else was preserved. Salted pork in the barrel, salted butter, hard cheeses made with salt, and above all, salted fish. Fish mattered enormously because the medieval church required fasting from meat on Fridays, on numerous holy days, and throughout the 40 days of Lent. Added together, meat was forbidden for well over a third of the year. And on all of those days, Europe ate fish. Inland Europe, hundreds of kilometers from any coast, could only eat fish that had been preserved, which meant salted herring and dried salted cod. Herring, in particular, became one of the pillars of the medieval economy. Vast schools of herring migrated through the North Sea and the Baltic, and the fleets that caught them needed staggering quantities of salt, because herring is an oily fish that spoils within hours. The breakthrough came in the 14th century, when a Flemish fisherman named Willem Boykelson was credited with perfecting a method of gutting and barrel salting herring at sea, in one continuous process, so that the fish went from the net into the brine almost immediately. A barrel of properly salted herring could last a year or more. On this humble, oily fish, an empire of commerce was built. The Hanseatic League, the great confederation of trading cities, Lübeck, Hamburg, Danzig, and dozens more, that dominated Northern European trade for centuries. The Hanse's power rested significantly on a triangle of trade: herring from the Baltic and North Sea, salt from the mines of Lüneburg and later from the salt pans of the French Atlantic coast, and grain from the east. Lübeck grew magnificent on this trade. The old salt warehouses still stand along its waterfront today. Meanwhile, in the south, another city was rising on salt, Venice. Before Venice was an empire of silk and spices, it was a merchant of salt. The lagoons around the city were natural salt pans, and Venice's earliest fortunes were made shipping salt to the cities of the Italian mainland. Later, the Venetian state took a more cunning approach. It subsidized merchants to bring salt from across the Mediterranean, then controlled its resale at monopoly prices. The profits from salt helped finance the ships, and the ships built the empire. One Venetian saying held that the city's true foundations were not wooden piles, but salt. And in the Alps, the archbishops of Salzburg grew rich enough on their salt mines to build one of the most beautiful Baroque cities in Europe, a city whose very name, as we have said, means salt castle. Even Europe's oldest operating industrial enterprises are tied to salt. The great mine of Wieliczka, near Krakow in Poland, produced salt continuously for over 700 years, and its miners carved entire chapels with chandeliers and altars out of the rock salt deep underground. They still stand, cathedrals of salt glittering in the darkness. Part 7. The Hated Tax. Salt and Revolution. But wherever salt created wealth, it also created resentment. Because governments across the world learned the same lesson the Chinese had learned 2,000 years earlier. Everyone must buy salt, and therefore salt is the perfect thing to tax. Nowhere was this lesson applied more harshly than in France. The French salt tax was called the gabelle, and by the 18th century it had grown into one of the most hated institutions in the kingdom. Under the gabelle, salt could only be purchased from royal depots, at prices inflated many times above its real cost. Worse still, in large parts of France, every person over the age of 8 was legally required to buy a minimum quantity of salt each year, whether they needed it or not. A forced purchase known as the sel de devoir, the salt of duty, and the tax was wildly unequal. Through historical accident and political privilege, some provinces paid crushing rates, while neighbouring regions paid almost nothing. The result was inevitable: smuggling on an industrial scale. Ordinary people, peasants, women, even children, carried contraband salt across provincial borders by night. They were called faux sauniers, false salt workers, and the state hunted them ruthlessly. Thousands were sent to the galleys or imprisoned each year. In the decades before the French Revolution, the gabelle had become a daily, visible symbol of everything unjust about the old regime. So it is no surprise that when the revolution came in 1789, the cahiers, the books of grievances drawn up by ordinary people across France, demanded the abolition of the gabelle over and over again. And one of the revolution's early acts was precisely that. The hated salt tax was swept away. It is a remarkable thought that among the sparks of one of history's greatest revolutions was the price of the crystals in your kitchen. Part 8. A handful of salt against an empire. And yet, the most extraordinary chapter in the political history of salt was still to come. For this, we move forward to the 20th century, to India. British colonial India inherited and expanded a salt monopoly of its own. Under the Raj, Indians were forbidden to collect or sell salt independently. They were required to buy taxed salt, much of it imported, even though salt lay freely on the beaches of their own coastline, left by the evaporating sea. For the poorest labourers, sweating under the Indian sun and losing salt with every hour of work, the tax was a genuine burden. But more than that, it was a symbol, a daily reminder that even the sea itself, in a sense, belonged to the colonizer. Mohandas Gandhi understood the power of that symbol perfectly. In 1930, when the Indian National Congress resolved to launch a campaign of civil disobedience against British rule, many of Gandhi's colleagues expected him to choose some grand constitutional issue. Instead, he chose salt. Some of them were baffled. Salt seemed so small, so trivial. But Gandhi saw what they did not: that salt touched every single Indian, of every religion, every caste, every region, the rich man and the beggar alike. There was no more universal grievance in existence. On the 12th of March 1930, Gandhi set out from his ashram with 78 followers and began to walk. The march covered roughly 380 kilometers over 24 days toward the coastal village of Dandi. Along the way, crowds gathered in the tens of thousands. The world's newspapers followed every step. And on the morning of the 6th of April, Gandhi walked down to the shore, bent over, and picked up a lump of natural salt from the mud. That was all. A man picking up salt from a beach. And it was illegal. With that single gesture, he broke the salt law of the British Empire and invited 300 million Indians to do the same. Across the country, people began making salt, selling salt, buying illegal salt. Tens of thousands were arrested, Gandhi among them. The salt itself was economically trivial, but as an act of theatre, as a demonstration that an empire's laws could be made unenforceable, it was devastating. Many historians regard the Salt March as the moment the moral legitimacy of British rule in India began, irreversibly, to dissolve, like salt in water. It is worth pausing on this. In 654 BC, a Chinese minister discovered that salt could quietly strengthen a state. In 1930 AD, an Indian lawyer discovered that salt could quietly destroy one. 2,500 years apart, the same white crystals, the same lesson about power. Part 9. Salt in the New World. Before we come to the end of salt's reign, let us cross the Atlantic briefly, because the young United States learned the old lessons of salt with remarkable speed. During the American Revolution, one of Britain's quiet strategies was to cut the colonies off from imported salt. Without salt, the Continental Army could not preserve meat for its winter camps, and civilian food supplies grew precarious. Salt works sprang up in desperation along the Atlantic coast, boiling seawater in makeshift pans, and George Washington's correspondence returns again and again to the anxious question of where the Army's salt would come from. Independence, it turned out, required sodium chloride. Decades later, salt shaped the very geography of American growth. The brine springs of Onondaga, near the town of Syracuse in upstate New York, became the young republic's great salt source. And when the state of New York built the Erie Canal in the 1820s, linking the Great Lakes to the Hudson River and the sea, salt was one of the cargoes that justified the enormous cost. Locals only half-jokingly called it the ditch that salt built, and taxes on Onondaga salt helped pay for its construction. The canal, in turn, opened the American interior to settlement. Follow the chain backward, and the westward expansion of the United States rests, in part, on brine bubbling out of the ground near Syracuse. And during the American Civil War, salt became a weapon once more. The Confederacy, largely cut off from imports by the Union naval blockade, faced a genuine salt famine. And without salt, the South could not preserve pork for its armies. Union forces deliberately targeted salt works along the southern coasts, and above all, the Great Salt Center at Saltville, Virginia, which was defended and attacked like a fortress. Some historians have argued that the slow starvation of the Confederate supply system, a starvation in which salt scarcity played a real part, did as much to end the war as any battlefield. Once again, the old rule held: no salt, no supply lines. No supply lines, no army. Part 10. How salt became ordinary. So how did it end? How did a substance once guarded by city walls, taxed by empires, and carried by armed caravans become the cheapest item in your kitchen? The answer, in a word, is science, arriving in three great waves. The first wave was geology and engineering. In the 19th century, systematic geological surveying revealed just how much salt the Earth actually contains. Those buried ancient seabeds we spoke of earlier turned out to be almost unimaginably vast. Under Cheshire in England, under Louisiana and Kansas in America, under Poland, Germany, Iran, Pakistan, steam-powered drilling and pumping made it cheap to extract. Salt was never truly rare, it was merely hard to reach. Once technology solved that, scarcity collapsed, and with it, price. The second wave was chemistry. Scientists discovered that salt was far more than a food. Sodium chloride is a fundamental raw material of the chemical industry, the starting point for chlorine, for sodium hydroxide, for the compounds behind paper, glass, soap, textiles, and eventually plastics. Today, only a small fraction of the world's salt production is actually eaten. Most of it feeds factories or is scattered on winter roads to melt ice. The mineral that once preserved fish now preserves entire industrial economies. The third wave was the strangest of all: refrigeration. Through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, artificial cooling, ice plants, refrigerated ships, and finally the household refrigerator, did something no king or revolution had ever managed. It broke salt's 4,000-year monopoly on time. Food no longer needed salt to survive the journey from harvest to table. The single most important reason for salt's power in human history, preservation, simply evaporated within 2 or 3 generations. The refrigerator humming quietly in your kitchen tonight is, in a sense, the machine that dethroned salt. And yet, even as salt became cheap, it performed one final act of world-changing service. In the early 20th century, doctors confirmed that goiter and certain forms of preventable intellectual impairment were caused by a lack of iodine in the diet. The solution was breathtakingly simple: add a trace of iodine to something everyone already ate. Switzerland and the United States began iodizing table salt in the 1920s, and the practice spread across the world. Public health experts consider iodized salt one of the cheapest and most effective health interventions in human history. Hundreds of millions of people protected by the same crystals that once paid Roman soldiers. Closing. And so, we arrive back where we began, at the small shaker on your table. It looks so humble now, but you know its secret. You know that the walls of Europe's first towns were raised to protect it, that the Egyptians used it to hold back death itself, that Chinese emperors funded their armies with it, and Confucian scholars debated its morality at court, that Rome's oldest road carried it, and Rome's soldiers were named for it, that Venice and Lubeck grew glorious on it, that French peasants were sent to the galleys for smuggling it, and that an elderly man in a homespun cloth shook an empire simply by lifting it from a beach. Salt teaches us the great, quiet lesson of this entire series: that history does not only live in palaces and parliaments, it lives in the pantry. The most ordinary things are often the ones that shaped us most deeply, precisely because everyone, everywhere, in every age, has needed them. The next time you pass the salt across a table, remember, just for a moment, that you are handing someone a piece of the oldest trade on Earth, a crystal of the ancient sea, the mineral that built empires. Sleep well, and when we meet again, we will follow the story of another quiet companion of your daily life, the dark, fragrant bean that woke up the world. Until then, good night.